Well, good morning to you, and again, let me say it's been a delight to be here for this weekend, and well, let me just pick it up. This is the outline that we have used, that I have on the screen, and very quickly, the Passion Week, and as I have said to the group last couple nights, all four Gospels are obviously selective. The authors are selecting material, and yet all of them give about 40% to this last week of Jesus' life. It's an 8-day week from Sunday to Sunday, and because of that, I mentioned that because of that, that each of the four Gospels gives 40% of his space to these last 8 days or so. And what that means, for number one, is that we can reconstruct it with a measure of detail that we can't bring to any other part of Jesus' life. And that's what we've sought to do. Now, the second inference I draw from that is that each of the Gospels gives 40% of his space to this week, is that God really wants us to know this. It's very important that we know this drama. And so this is the outline we've used very, very quickly. Sunday is a day of messianic presentation, and what I mean by that is that is the day. There is a verse in the Old Testament which anticipated that day specifically, and that day, by the way, by my reckoning, 33 AD crucifixion. That would mean that day of the triumphal entry was March 29th, 33 AD. And there is a verse in the Old Testament, I mentioned this to the crowd earlier, that anticipates that day specifically, and everybody in the room knows that verse, but we don't usually connect it to this day. And the verse is, "This is the day which the Lord has made, we will be glad and rejoice in it." And that's out of Psalm 118, which is the psalm which God gave Israel to teach them how to receive their Messiah. And they were to cry out, "This is the day that only God could make," the day when finally that long-awaited promised deliverer of Genesis 3:15 makes his appearance. That happened on Sunday, as I say, March 29th, and that is the day of official, deliberate, dramatic, messianic presentation. But we asked the question, given Sunday, why Friday? And I suggest that the answer is, given Sunday, they receive him with such excitement. Why on Friday is the same crowd crying for his crucifixion? And I think the answer is Monday and Tuesday. We spent a good deal of time with this. But in short, on Monday and Tuesday, Jesus behaved more messianically than any other time in his ministry. And on Tuesday afternoon, as he left the city for the last time under his own power, the next time he leaves the city, he's going to be carrying a cross, but on Tuesday afternoon, he leaves the city with a decision when he pronounces this series of withering woes. "Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees." And what he is doing is driving that city to a decision. It's either me or the Pharisees. And that's Tuesday, and I like to say that on Friday morning, and we will talk about that in a moment, when Pilate says, "Whom would you have me give you, Barabbas or Jesus?" and they say, "Give us Barabbas." On Tuesday, he drove them to a decision. It's me or the Pharisees. On Friday, they announced their verdict. Give us Barabbas. And so, given Sunday, why Friday? Wednesday's a silent but busy day because on Tuesday night, there's a plot laid. Judas goes down to the Hill of Evil Counsel and offers to enable the Sanhedrinists, the Jewish leadership, who are mad beyond words, offers them to help them arrest Jesus, Luke 22, verse 6, in the absence of the multitude. And he knows that will be at the Passover. So Wednesday is a busy day as everything is put in place to spring that trap, to carry out that plot. And I made much of this, that the plot, that is laid on Tuesday night and prepared for on Wednesday, the plot is to get Jesus arrested, tried, sentenced, and on his way to execution before the city wakes up. That's everything. Because again, both Jesus' enemies, both Roman and Jewish, have ringing in their ears Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday, the triumphal entry, the possession of the temple. And they have every reason to believe that if the city realizes that their hero, the one whom they accepted as king, worshiped as king, welcomed, say, as king, on Sunday is now on trial for his life, there would be a riot. So this whole, now, Thursday, I call it Day of Messianic Preparation on 2 counts in the upper room. It is preparation of his disciples with the discourse and so on. But then Jesus, what happens, and this is drawing near to where we're actually going to pick the story up, what happens is that Judas is there in the upper room. Jesus announces the hand of the betrayers at the table. Judas makes an excuse, and he goes off to fetch the soldiers and the Sanhedrin. While he is gone, Jesus introduces the Lord's Supper and then begins to teach, so let not your heart be troubled, go to prepare a place for you, and so on. But then very suddenly in John 14 and verse 31, Jesus says, arise, let us go. And because he knows that Judas is going to bring the soldiers back to the upper room. That's where Judas left them. So Jesus makes his way down to a farm, to an agriculture. Actually, it's a winery. It's a wine producing installation called. In the Bible, when you read about a garden, it's in every case it's a farm. Okay, it's some sort of agricultural installation. The Garden of Gethsemane is just that, and so he makes his way down to Gethsemane, and you have that stunning and important season of prayer, which I think I may reference just quickly in the morning service. But then Jesus because what happens is Judas goes back to the upper room. He finds it empty. And it's the middle of the night. The city is crowded beyond what we can imagine for Passover. But Judas knows because Jesus, John 18 and verse 2 says that Jesus, when he was in Jerusalem, would often stay in that Garden of Gethsemane. It has a cave that's very, very, good place for spending the night. And so he would often stay there. And so now Judas realizes that must be where he is. So he makes his way with the soldiers and Sanhedrin. Now here comes Jesus, having spent that season of prayer with angelic help, if you don't mind. Luke tells us in Luke 22, staggers from the garden, wakes his disciples, and now Judas comes and Jesus is arrested. Jesus takes careful steps to protect the disciples, but they flee, and now Jesus is taken. And you have, first of all, the Jewish trials. And we talked about that yesterday. They're not really trials. I always get after myself. They are hearings because the problem, and we spent a lot of time with this, but the problem that the Jewish leaders have is that they have convinced Pontius Pilate, who is the Roman officer, of course, they have convinced him to convene his judicial apparatus outside of where he is staying. It's called Herod's Palace, but they don't want to defile themselves, you remember, so the Jewish leaders had gotten him to move his whole judicial apparatus out onto a courtyard I'm going to describe in just a moment, and he is going to meet them at the first blush of dawn, which is about 4:30. And I always say not pink but gray, just the very first blush, because the Jewish leaders have convened in the middle of the night at the priestly villa of the high priest, who is Caiaphas, who is the primary villain in this story. But they have convened because they have no indictment. They're going to go to Pilate and try to make the case that Jesus ought to be crucified because he is a seditionist. He is a pretender king. And the Romans have no tolerance, whatever, they can't, for pretender kings. And so if the Sanhedrinists are by reason of Jesus' popularity, they can't just haul them off and stone them. There'll be a riot and their heads will roll. So they have to get the Romans involved. The Romans have to do their dirty work. And the only way to get them to do that is to convince the Roman authorities, Pontius Pilate, that this man is a threat to Rome. He's a seditionist. And so they spend the night, several hours in the middle of the night, the Jewish authorities do, trying to find some, they need an indictment. They need somebody who can say, I heard him say he's Messiah King, but they couldn't find anybody. And finally, Caiaphas put Jesus under oath and said, tell us, are you the Christ, the Son of the living God? Jesus said, I am, absolutely, bingo. I mean, the way he responds is absolutely. And I think Caiaphas was at once delighted and surprised, but now we got him. So now they're going to take him to Pilate. And again, the whole, and this is about 4:30 in the morning. I'm going to say again, this has to happen in their mind. This whole plot, which they have laid beginning on Tuesday night, has to happen while the city sleeps. Does that make sense to you? So now we have Jesus taken to Pilate. Now I want to take you to a verse. And 1 Timothy 6 and verse 13. And I'll tell you something. This, you know how sometimes there's a verse that you're familiar with it and so on, but you're reading and all of a sudden it just jumps off the page at you. Several years ago, this really got a hold of me because he says this. Paul is, obviously, he's concluding his epistle to young Timothy, and he says, I urge you in the sight of God who gives life to all things. And then he says this, and I urge you before Christ Jesus, who witnessed the good confession before Pontius Pilate. And I thought, now wait a minute, there is evidently, there was something about the way Jesus conducted himself before Pontius Pilate that was so meaningful and so familiar to the early Christian community that Paul could simply say, Timothy, press yourself into that mold. I urge you by the good confession. And I had to admit, I didn't know what it was. So I went back and have spent some time, and I want to take you to John chapter 18, and go away. John chapter 18 is where the, verse 28, is where the Jewish authorities, having finally elicited from Jesus the confession that he is Messiah. Now, Messiah means a lot of things. It's kind of interesting. In the Old Testament, Mashiach, or Christos, as we know in the Greek, is not a real important term. It's used, but it's just one of several terms and so on. During the to refer to the deliverer of Genesis 3, but during the intertestamental time, it became, in the Jewish mind and parlance, it became the one word that wrapped up everything that they were looking for in that long-awaited deliverer. And above all things, folks, it meant king. It means other things, but Messiah means king. And so the point is that, well, I'll just pick it up here. It says, then they led Jesus from Caiaphas, that is his priestly villa, which is very, very close by, the Praetorium. And it was early morning. And it says, they themselves did not go into the Praetorium, lest they should be defiled, in order they might eat the Passover. Now there's a significant issue in that verse, but it is perfectly resolvable, but I'm not going to stop on it. And he says, Pilate then went out. Okay, so he brought him to Pilate at the Praetorium. Now listen, real quickly, Praetorium it's a Roman word, and it refers to the personal domicile of the senior officer. It actually comes from the battlefield. And on the battlefield, you'd have all arranged in battle array, but there'd be one tent, well guarded, very special. That's where the senior officer, that's the Praetorium. Well, Pilate, Pontius Pilate, he is the prefect. Rome had dispatched him to govern this region, and he was the prefect from 26 to 36. This is 33. And when he lived in Caesarea Maritima, I won't go into it, but down on the coast, where he is staying in Jerusalem is Herod's palace. Now let's make sure we're all on the same page. Herod is a dead guy, okay? Herod the Great died in 1 BC, but he built himself just a beautiful, beautiful, unspeakably beautiful palace in Jerusalem, which is where he lived. Herod lived in Jerusalem. Now, he built a palace, summer palace down in Caesarea Maritima where you go to vacation. By the time you get to the New Testament, by the time you get to Jesus' life, and by now the prefect is living in Caesarea, but he would come up and he would stay in Herod's palace. Now, there's some debate about this. Here, let me say, all right, let me just use my slides here. I tried to frame some questions yesterday morning, went through those, and this is the last one. And that is Pontius Pilate, villain or hero? And I told people, and I'm going to try and talk you into it. It ain't going to be easy, but I'm going to try and talk you into it. I like to say I am the founder and president of the Pontius Pilate fan club. Honest to goodness, Pontius Pilate is one of my greatest heroes in the Bible. And I'm going to try and talk you into that here in the next few minutes. But real quickly, here, I want to set this up. Because without getting into it, all right, real quickly, there is the idea, and it's dead wrong, and nobody holds to it anymore, but up here to the north of the Temple Mount is the Fortress Antonia. That's where the troops were stationed. And the Crusaders got everything wrong. They killed everybody and destroyed local memory. And so when they tried to recraft things, they got everything wrong. And they built the tradition that Jesus was tried at the Fortress Antonia. So what does that mean? That would mean that when Pilate lived in Caesarea Maritima, came up for the feast, he would stay in the Fortress Antonia. Makes no sense. Nobody believes it anymore. I don't want to get into it. So, on the other hand, he would stay. And the big argument was always, it was well fortified. Well, let me just tell you something. I won't get into it too deeply, but Herod the Great, the man who built this palace down here on the western side, he never went anywhere. He never slept a night, but what he was in a thoroughly fortified place. He had good reason to be. All right, so I'll just leave it alone. Now, so I would argue that in point of fact, let's just get to it. Here is, and this is a fun story. Here is a replica. All right, let me back up. Herod built this palace on the western side of the city. He wanted to catch the Mediterranean breezes. And the only way to get into it when he built it was to go through the city. And he actually had gone out to visit the grave of his favorite wife, whom he had murdered some years ago. And when he came back, the authorities in Jerusalem wouldn't let him in because, this is Herod the Great, because he was unclean. Well, he got in, but he decided he was going to build a gate on the west side of the city. So if he's on the west side of the city, he's on the west side of his palace. That makes sense to you? So now he could go straight into his palace. And we know a lot about this. And what's really fascinating is that archaeologists, students, and so on knew for decades that there was a gate somewhere on the western side of the city, but they never found it. And in the late 70s, the IAA, the Israel Antiquities Authority, decided up until that time, this is what you see there on the top left. That is the modern wall of the city. It was built by Suleiman the Magnificent in the 1540s. It's Ottoman Turkish, but it is the modern wall. On the other hand, it follows the line of Herod's wall on the western side because it's the top of a hill. Now, up until the 1970s, all along there was dirt that covered all that area. It was all buried. Does that make sense to you? And they decided to uncover it. And they knew they'd discover a gate, and they discovered this gate. Now, Shimon Gibson, I've got to know him. He's a very important archaeologist, wrote a book developing this, and he walked me through this. Do you know Joel Kramer? Oh, get to know Joel Kramer. But Joel introduced me to Shimon Gibson. But I can't stop. Interestingly, can you see this? It's small. But can you see that, what I've circled? It's a arrow slit. Does that make sense? High on the wall. Shimon said when he came, he was a boy, and he volunteered for this, and when he came, he would put his lunch in that arrow slit. Does that make sense to you? So that's how much this area was totally covered over, this western wall. And they stripped it away, and when they did, they discovered this gate. And it's a gate system, as is always the case. So there's an inner gate coming out of the palace, and then there is a courtyard, and then there is an outer gate. And the inner gate is here, right here, and the outer gate would be right above these steps. And they found these ceremonial steps and so on. Not ceremonial, kind of royal steps approaching the palace. And it was hugely fortified. So I'll just go to it. The picture on the bottom right is a reconstruction. And here is the outer gate. And then beyond in the courtyard would be an inner gate. And what I want to do, what do you care? All right. So let's recreate it. And one of the most important things, or one of the fascinating things, is they found a set of steps, and at the top of that steps there's a platform, and on that platform there is strong, I think ungainsayable, archaeological evidence that at the top of that platform there was a bema seat, a judgment seat. So let's recreate it. Let's say that here at the outer edge of the platform is the outer wall. And just yonder there, let's put it just, on the back wall, there's the gate going into the praetorium. And then over here, there's an outer gate right here. So here's an outer gate through the wall. There's an inner gate, takes you into the courtyard of Herod's palace, the domicile, the praetorium. And then in that corner, picture a stairway and then a raised platform with a bema seat. And the platform was constructed because this was used. Josephus has about 5 different incidents which happen at this gate in the course of time. And so in this case, the prefect, Pilate, he can stand there, and in Herod's case, the king, he could stand there, and he could look over the wall, and he could see the crowds, and he could address the crowds. That make sense to you? All right, now that's very important, because now I'm going to walk you through, there it is. There's what it looks like today. Again, the inner gate is here, the outer gate would be right here, the bema seat would be over here, and I'll tell you what, this is one of the highlights for me for taking people to Israel, because you can go through here and walk through this whole thing. And Gibson dug it out. He's written popularly. He hasn't written formally, and nobody knows it's there. I mean, soon enough, they're going to build a big church there, and you're not going to be able to see it. You're going to have to get money to get at it, But you just go, and you got the app. Oh, I love it. But anyway, so there it is again. All right, now let's go to John chapter 18, and I'm going to walk you through the trial before Pilate. All right, we got to hurry. But he says to himself, listen, the reason, Paul said, I adjure thee by the good confession. And I would argue that the way Jesus conducts himself before Pontius Pilate is the most stunning and important pattern of how we ought to conduct ourselves before. And they may come when you and I will stand before hostile authorities. And the way Jesus handles himself, and there's nothing of cockiness, there's nothing, he is so deferential, and appropriately deferential. All right, a lot I could say, but let me just get started here. But here's the interesting thing. Paul talks about the good confession that Jesus made. You go back and trace the narrative we're about to trace. Jesus before Pilate the first time, and then before Herod Antipas, and then before Pilate the second time, and Jesus never speaks, except 2 times where Pilate takes Jesus alone inside the praetorium. That's the good confession. And that's what I want to trace. So let's just trace the narrative. It says, Pilate then went out to them and said, what accusation did you bring against the man? So let's picture it. It's 4:30 in the morning. Pilate, I'm sure a lot of drachmas have changed hands to get Pilate to do that. He's not going to come shuffling out here in his bathrobe and bunny slippers, I like to say. He's got his full judicial apparatus, all the appropriate soldiers and so on. And now Pilate comes out, picture him, comes out, and here's the outer gate. So here come the Jewish accusers. It's about 4:30. The city's asleep. They bring Jesus, and it's very close. Caiaphas's villa is only about 75 yards south. So it didn't take them long. Once they got him to say, I am the Christ, oh, we got you now, don't we? So they brought him, and they're so excited, the Jewish accusers, because they have worked so hard to make this happen, and it was almost impossible. But it worked. We got him arrested. We got him to confess he is Christ, the King, and so we got him now. And so they bring him to Pilate. Pilate comes out, and he says, what accusation to bring against this man? And they said, if he were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him up to you. Now, what's at stake, I think, is they're saying, Pilate, we got to get this done before the city wakes up. Our agents went to your agents. We paid you a lot of money. I think this is probably what happened. You agreed, just play along. Your job is just to send him off to crucifixion. Well, Pilate's not going to do it. And Pilate said to them, well, then you take him and judge him according to your law. And notice what they say. The Jews, now please understand that at this stage of the narrative, and in most of the Gospel of John, when he uses the word the Jews, he means the leadership, specifically the Sanhedrin. So the Jews, that's all that's involved, the city's asleep, said to him, it's not lawful for us to put anyone to death. Now, that demonstrates that this is not a trial. It's an execution. And now John goes on and gives us an insight in verse 32 that I want to come back to. So let me leave it alone for now. So then it says in verse 33, then Pilate entered the praetorium again, called Jesus. All right, now let's watch it happen. Pilate, he's frustrated. These Jewish leaders are just trying to, gang roll him, as it were, comes down off his steps, takes Jesus perhaps by the arm, or goes in and calls Jesus. So now it's Jesus and Pilate alone in the praetorium. And this conversation unfolds. Pilate entered, and Pilate said to him, now follow this, are you the king of the Jews? Now you see, the problem with that question is it is cripplingly ambiguous. It might mean, are you the long-awaited legitimate Messiah, king of the Jews? Could mean that. And you're saying, would Pilate ask that? Yeah, he would. Or it could mean, are you a seditionist? Are you a pretender king? Are you a threat to are you claiming to be the king of the Jews? And Jesus, and we talked a lot about this in our time together, and I stressed how important it is to take very seriously and factor into all of these narratives the real humanity of Jesus. And there were moments when the Spirit of God enabled him to know supernaturally. A woman had 5 husbands and so on. But that's not how he lived his life. It was only as the Spirit. I always say that the Spirit of God enabled Peter to know that Ananias and Sapphira were lying, don't you think? But you don't jump to that. That's how he lived his whole life, for heaven's sakes, when the Spirit enabled him. So, and in this case, the Spirit and Jesus was jealous for the truth, and so he asks the appropriate question. He says, and again, I can't stress this strong enough. Pilate, listen, many of you weren't here, but let me just say real quickly. We talked yesterday about the Jewish hearings, and so many things about that was illegal. So many things were illegal. There were so many ways in which that really was dead wrong. They had no right to try him. I won't go into it. Nothing about what Pilate is doing is illegal. He is a Roman officer. His primary responsibility is to protect Rome. He is given the assignment of Judea and Samaria, and more seditions happen there than anywhere else in the Roman Empire. And so he has not only the right, he has absolutely the responsibility to get to the bottom of this. And he does it carefully. Now you might be saying, well, wait a minute. Isn't he interrogating the accused? Is that legal? You bet it is for the Romans, not for the Jews. If you're a Roman citizen, That can't happen. But Jesus is not a citizen. Nothing about what Pilate does is illegal. I don't think it's not inappropriate. The way he handles himself is so noble. Now, I'll stop on this real quickly. You've been taught, whether directly or indirectly, that Pilate is a rogue and he's very he's just kind of a loose cannon who cares nothing about the Jews. It's not true. There are two Roman historians. They are Philo and Josephus. I can walk you through it, and they tell stories about Pilate and make him look like an irresponsible, unresponsive, cruel. Both of those men have axes to grind. I could tell you exactly why. And Roman historians read that, and they call it not biblical historians, but they'll say that is character assassination. So I'm saying that Pilate handles himself with every deliberate, I think, and appropriate spirit. All right, so go back to the story. He takes him inside, just the two of them. Are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus has to straighten this out. So he says in verse 34, he says, are you speaking? It's an ambiguous question. So he says, are you speaking for yourself about this? Are you asking me from your heart if I'm the king? Or did others tell you concerning me? What he's saying is, are you asking me whether from your heart, or are you asking me if it's true what people are saying about me? And Pilate says, and he says, am I a Jew, your own nation? Now again, Pilate, I'll keep going because his spirit, I think, really becomes clear later on. He says, am I a Jew, your own nation, and the chief priests have delivered you to me? What have you done? Now, folks, I want you to get very much in touch with the situation. It's well spelled out for us. Jesus and Pilate alone in the praetorium. Pilate, a duly authorized, careful judge. Are you a seditionist? That's the only question. What have you done? Are you a seditionist? Now, listen, I cherish Jesus' answer. But his answer in verse 36 is probably one of the 3 or 4 most misused and twisted verses in all the New Testament. My kingdom is not of this world. I'm not going to get into this. Pastor can straighten out for you. You know, if this doesn't make sense, don't even worry about it. But I got a lot of amillennialist friends. I swear, if anyone drops his Bible accidentally, it flops open to this verse. I'm saying, this is their verse. My kingdom is not of this world. So it's not a spirit. It's not what the Old Testament promised. It's not what everybody's looking for. And all right, I just leave it alone. What does Jesus mean? He says, my kingdom is not of this world. If we wonder what he means by of this world, it wouldn't hurt to read the next sentence. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight so that I should not be delivered to the Jews. I said yesterday that this is why it was so important that Peter put that sword away earlier when he was arrested. But now my kingdom, I'll read it again. My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight so that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now my kingdom doesn't come in this way. My kingdom is not from here. He is responding deliberately, specifically, and convincingly to the question, are you a seditionist? Are you a king? Are you a pretender? Are you a threat to Rome? Now again, there is the great majority, I think, of evangelicals in our day read this verse and they think that Jesus is saying, no. Mine is not a physical, literal kingdom. It's not what the Old Testament promised. Well, now wait a minute. It's about 4:30 in the morning. Jesus is alone in the praetorium with Pilate. Pilate asked a very legitimate question. And Jesus takes the opportunity to deliver himself of a one-sentence lecture on kingdom theology that totally unsays everything the Old Testament ever said. Are you with me? I don't think so. Jesus, and here's the reason that I get myself exercised about this. Now there's a little more, but Pilate, after this interchange, is going to go out and announce the man is innocent. Again and again, Pilate is going to insist, at the risk of his life, at the risk of his career, to be sure, Pilate is going to insist the man is not a seditionist. I'm not going to crucify him. To the frustration of the Jewish leaders, it's one of the most noble scenes for Pilate to absolutely. Here's my question. How came Pilate to that conviction? How did he get persuaded that Jesus is not a seditionist? That is an airtight legal, historical argument. When Jesus simply said, now, Pilate, and let me say, Pilate had never, there wasn't a sedition in Israel while Pilate was prefect there. But before he went there, he had been very carefully trained in what a Jewish sedition looks like. And in every case, some pretender Messiah would make his way down to the Jeshimon and find himself a hideout and put together a little militia and fall on the Roman troops and the Roman armories and so on. And so Jesus simply says, Pilate, if my kingdom were of this world, if I were guilty of what they're, then would my servants fight that I be not taken. And I think Pilate may have, stood there and scratched his chin and thought, you know what? I don't live in a cave. And this man has been going up and down the countryside for the better part of 3 years. And there are hundreds of thousands of people who absolutely, they're committed to him. Not one of them has ever raised a fist or a sword against Rome. Matter of fact, they're probably some of the best subjects I have. And Pilate became convinced on the basis of not just Jesus' testimony, but the substance of his testimony, that sedition looks like something. And none of that has happened. And so you would have to be insane, the kind of insanity that happens when you set yourself in opposition to God and his Messiah. But you would have to be insane to think that Jesus was a seditionist. So I'm saying that marvelous, marvelous argument is what Jesus uses to fully and finally convince the judge, Pontius Pilate, that he is not guilty of what he's being accused of. Hugely important. But then he says, now I got to be quick, and then he says, are you a king then? Now I think Pilate was a seeker. Listen, that question has nothing to do with the judicial proceedings. Now he's asking, all right, I've been here for some years. I know something about the Jewish people. I know they're looking for a Messiah king. Are you the guy? And you know what? I'll tell you something. Jesus was a premillennialist, and I love his reply here. You know what you would say if you're a premillennialist? That there is going to be a literal kingdom that God is going to establish on this earth, and the pre-part is Jesus has to come to make it happen. That's all you said. There's going to be a kingdom, and Jesus is going to make it happen. Oh, I'm a son of the kingdom. I love we get a little too fixated on heaven. Heaven's just a stopover. It beats all the alternatives, for heaven's sakes. But the fact is that you're not going to spend eternity off in some never. You're going to on this earth, but Messiah is going to be ruling. And I love this phrase out of Habakkuk: the knowledge of the glory of the Lord will cover the earth as water covers the sea. Does that not take your breath away? We are bound for a kingdom. And I love what Jesus said. You say rightly that I'm a king. It was for this cause that I was born, for this cause that I've come into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth. And that is a definite article, but I'm convinced it has demonstrative force. It should be read this, that I should bear witness to that truth, this truth, that I am the king. And then he says this, remember this, everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. All right, now, Pilate says, what is truth? Everybody reads that like this is the standard. Pilate was what is truth? Nothing about this would suggest that that's his spirit. I think he is saying, what is truth? What am I going to do? I have the Jewish leaders. I have, and I'm telling you, this is the hottest hot potato mankind ever experienced. Because the whole city seems like it's ready to explode in a riot as far as Pilate's concerned, and he's got the Jewish leaders. What am I going to do? What is truth? But at any rate, now I'm going to be quick. So now, Pilate comes out, brings Jesus out. Picture Pilate walking up in his judicial robes, taking his seat, perhaps sitting down, and of course the Jewish leaders are down here, ho, 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 let's go, okay, we got to get him to the cross. And Pilate says, I find no fault in him at all. Now, I got a hyperspeed here, but what happens is that, of course, the Jewish leaders go ballistic. And no, he's trouble ever since Galilee. All right, time out. I'm going to stay in John, but you have to realize that, as is the case in all of his life, but becomes rather dramatically apparent with regard to these trials, no one gospel gives us everything. So now you go to Luke, and you discover that they said he's been making trouble ever since Galilee. Pilate thinks, wait a minute, I'm not in charge of Galilee. If this is Galilee, I'll send him to Herod Antipas. Now, Herod Antipas rules Galilee and Perea, but Galilee, and he lives, his capital is at Tiberias. But he too, just as Pontius Pilate had come up from Caesarea Maritima to be in the city at the feast, so Herod Antipas was in town. And there's some debate as to where he would stay, but how we say, that edifice right there, that praetorium, is Herod's palace, built by King Herod. Who was Herod Antipas's daddy? Herod the Great. Herod Antipas grew up in that building. And that makes sense to you? So when he comes to town, I'm sure he still has quarters. He may have the same posters on the wall. You know what I'm saying? So I think Herod Antipas is right there. And they can just, okay, haul him across the courtyard, and he appears before Herod Antipas. Nothing comes of it. Herod Antipas wants to see a miracle, and Jesus is mute. He never says a thing. And they hurl all these accusations, and nothing comes of it. So that's the second stage of the trial. First of all, for Pontius Pilate. Secondly, before Herod Antipas. But now what happens is that I think while Jesus is gone, and I don't think Pilate had any strong hope that this was going to materialize, but it was going to really help. But while he is gone, the city starts to wake up. Now, can you imagine with what wildfire speed the report would go throughout that crowded city that this one whom we welcomed on Sunday morning and cheered on Monday and Tuesday is now on trial for his life? And it's on the western side of the city where there's a huge open lawn. Thousands can gather. So Pilate is sitting up there. He can see over the wall. He sees the people start to come, and he thinks, I got an idea. This is genius, and it is. I'll offer the people Jesus instead of Barabbas. Now, what's Pilate thinking? They love him. They worshiped him as king. Oh, my goodness. Now, we talked about it. I haven't got time to do it, but maybe I did mention on Tuesday afternoon, Jesus drove them to a decision when he said, me or the Pharisees. Pilate didn't know that. So Pilate said, this is great. So now they bring him back, and Pilate says to the multitude, you have a custom that I should release someone to you, and therefore do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews? It's interesting. Do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews? Why does he say that? The one whom you welcomed as king. You were throwing down your garments and singing a Hosanna. So yeah, to you, he's the king. So who would you rather have me? Is this a tough choice? Barabbas, the murderer, robber, or your king? Which would you want? And Pilate is astounded. He's stunned when the people say, give us. The Bible says that the Jewish priests persuaded the people, and they began to say, give us Barabbas. And then Pilate says, well, what do you want me to do? Pilate's totally stunned and confused. What do you want me to do with Jesus, whom you call your Messiah? Crucify him. And no matter what he does, they insist, crucify him. And so I believe that, the way I put it together, I think Pilate more or less despaired of delivering Israel. What time have we done? 10 o'clock. I think Pilate, and so he decided, now listen, I'll talk about this in the morning service, but crucifixion, this is hugely important, as the Romans developed it, and they fine-tuned, a hoary head had been around for a long time, but they took it, and they fine-tuned it, and they made certain demands, and one of them was that it had to be cruel. And so normally, in more situations, especially for a seditionist, had been tried, there would be a scourging. Now, the scourging was not 40 less 1. It was surgical. It was designed, quite frankly, to open up lateral wounds all across the man's backside, because once you are affixed to a cross, you can't breathe without pushing yourself up. Your rib cage settles in on your breathing apparatus, and very quickly you can't sleep on the cross, you can't go into a coma, you suffocate, because you have to push yourself. Every time you do, your back's up against that beam with the splinters. And so I think that's what Pilate does. I think he's more or less said, okay, I tried. And so he is scourged, and that's when he's taken undoubtedly. Now listen, Josephus tells us a good deal about that Herod's palace and its wonders and so on. At the southern end, there was a barrack. Now, it wasn't really a barracks. It was for the Praetorian Guard, that crack unit that guarded Herod's life. And so it was very plush, undoubtedly had a place where there would be punishments, perhaps a scourging place. So I think they probably take Jesus in, and he is, in fact, scourged. And real quick, when you see representations of this, so much time is given to the scourging. It was awful, but it was brief and surgical. It wasn't, because another thing that Rome demanded it to be cruel, but they also demanded that it be lingering. They didn't want to weaken the man because they wanted him to last on the cross for at least a couple of days. That was pretty standard. Having said it, the point is, while they're in there, they put the crown of thorns on there. Now, I want you to picture this. Pilate is on while this scourging is going on, I picture Pilate on his bema seat, and now they bring Jesus out, and Pilate sees him, and Pilate is gripped. And so he comes, and I picture him standing here, right in this outer gate, Jesus with him, and Jesus now bloodied and horribly, horribly misused, and Pilate says, "Behold the man." Notice what it says. The soldiers twisted and so on. Then Pilate went out again and said to them, "Behold, I'm bringing him out to you, that you may know that I find no fault in him." That's amazing. And then Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, and Pilate said, "Behold the man." I think what he is saying is, look at him. You're saying that this man is a threat to Rome. I'll scourge him and let him go. That's what he says in Luke. But on the other hand, and this is hugely important, verse 6, when the chief priests and officers saw him, they cried out, saying, "Crucify him, crucify him." And Pilate said to him, "You take and crucify him, for I find no fault in him." Folks, honest to goodness, it staggers me that so many people read this and find Pilate to be some sort of a villain. When he insists on this again and again, he's putting himself and his career at risk, okay? And these are very, very powerful Jewish leaders. And he's got, the simplest thing in the world. Ooh, man, this could explode before the sun comes up. Send him on. But he doesn't. He refuses. And when he says, I find that then the Jews answered, and this is a hugely important verse, 19:7, we have a law, and according to our law, he ought to die because he made himself the Son of God. What they're saying is, all right, we're not going to convince you that he's a seditionist, and they knew very well he wasn't a seditionist. But they said, and here's where the real motive comes out, by our law he ought to die because Jesus went to the cross because he claimed to be God come in the flesh. That's what you have right there. He ought to die. Now, when Pilate heard that, he's standing here with Jesus, defending him, and now they say he's the Son of God. And look at verse 8. When Pilate heard that saying, he was the more afraid, and he went again this is the second time. So now Pilate takes Jesus, by now with the crown of thorns and the cheap purple robe and bloodied and scourged, and Pilate and Jesus go for a second time into the praetorium, and you have just a stunning conversation. In verse 8, he took him into the praetorium and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" Now, come on. He's not saying, "Where'd you grow up?" for heaven's sakes. I think what he is saying is, "Who in the world are you? What is going on? These people who exploded in happy welcome as king just a few days ago, no matter what I do. Who in the world are you? And Pilate, again, I think factor into that the fact that Pilate knew that Jesus was guilty of nothing. You know, I asked the other day, at this point in Jesus' ministry, at the end of Jesus' ministry, how many degrees of separation might there have been between anybody in the land of Israel and somebody who got healed? Pilate had to know people who were lame all their life and now they're walking. You know what I'm saying? So you factor in, and Pilate's saying, where are you from? Who in the world are you? Jesus won't answer him. And so Jesus gave him no answer. Now, I'm going to put a reading on this that I think I can defend, but it's going to be foreign to you. So I'm asking you to stay with me. Pilate said to him, are you not speaking to me? Now, again, this is usually read as bravado. Hey, do you realize who I am? I'm the guy who has a, are you not going to speak to me? Or don't you? I don't think that's it at all. I think he's saying, Jesus, I need some help here. Are you going to speak to me? Don't you realize that I'm the guy. I got to decide. I've been given the authority to either crucify you or release you. And Jesus says, and my imagination is going to get away with me, but I wonder if Jesus maybe didn't step closer to Pilate and with his bloody hands take Pilate by the shoulders and look into the eye and say, Pilate, you would have no power at all against me unless it had been given you from above. Therefore, the one who delivered me to you has the greater sin. Now, I know that everybody reads that. I don't think it'll work to mean my Father above, in which Jesus is being a little snarky. Yeah, Pilate, don't take too much to yourself. You wouldn't even be here if my Father hadn't put you there. I don't think Jesus would conduct himself that way, I'll tell you up front. But more importantly, if that's what he means, there's no possible way to make sense of the next sentence where he says, therefore. How does that make sense? You're only here because God put you here, and therefore the one who turned me over has the greater sin. No. I would argue that from above means you received it from Roman authorities above. All he's saying is, Pilate, you have no authority at all, except you were assigned this jurisdiction. This is not your fight. You didn't hunt me down. You're only here because you were assigned this jurisdiction. You were given this from authority above you. Therefore, now it makes all the sense in the world. Therefore, the one who turned me over to you has the greater sin. All right, now, just as a thought exercise, to be nice to me, let's just, as a thought exercise, assume that that's what Jesus means. And I really think it is. I think he's saying, Pilate, this is not your fight. You're only here because you were assigned this jurisdiction. The real wickedness, therefore the greater sin, is that of Caiaphas, the one who turned me over to you. All right, if you allow me that as a thought exercise, the next question is, the big question is, what is Jesus saying? I believe that Jesus is giving Pilate permission to go ahead. Now you think about it. This is real. And Jesus has to go to the cross. And Pilate has a role to play. And by reason of a reserve of character and resolve that we might not have expected of him, in point of fact, he is insisting it's not going to happen. And I think Jesus is giving him permission to go ahead, because what's going to happen, and this is in Matthew and Luke, but let me just, Pilate's going to come out, and he's going to, well, it says right here in John 19, it says, from then on, Pilate sought to release him. So he brings Pilate out, Pilate brings him out, and he works harder to persuade the Jewish leaders and so on. But they say, if you let this man go, you are not Caesar's friend. So this is their trump card. Without getting into it, I can tell you a lot about Pilate's career, and he stepped in a couple of cow pies, and he's had to back up big time a couple of times, and he knows that he's used up all his coupons in Rome. He knows that. And so when the leaders say, we'll tell Tiberius, we'll tell the Caesar, but I think more importantly than that, I think in the back of Pilate's mind is Jesus' words. It's not your fight. The real crime. And so this is the way I picture it. I'm putting Gospels together here, but I just kind of make it dramatic. I think perhaps Pilate leaves Jesus standing here in the sight of the people. He goes back up to his bema seat. He calls for a basin and a towel. And with some ceremony, he sits there and he takes that towel and he wipes his hands of it. I am free of the blood of this man. Now he walks down, and I picture him going into the praetorium, and maybe as he walks into the praetorium, taking that towel, handed it to a soldier, and looking back over his shoulder and saying, "You do with him what you will." He never condemned Jesus as a seditionist. He insisted, now, folks, theologically, we got to be done. And of course, at that point, he is going to be, we'll pick this up in the morning service. But let me tell you something. For reasons that I'm going to develop in the morning service, it was absolutely expedient. Jesus, by his own testimony, if I am lifted up, then I'll draw him into myself. He was talking about dying by crucifixion. And Jesus contrived to die by crucifixion. And I'll tell you why I think that's so very, very important. It has to do, by the way, with the stench coming out of Lazarus' tomb that we talked about yesterday. But my point is, by Jesus' own testimony, and for reasons that I think are entirely recoverable, it was absolutely expedient that he die at the hands of the Romans as a seditionist. But it was just as important that he die as a sinless Lamb of God. And by reason of Pilate's role, both of those seemingly irreconcilable realities come to pass. On the one hand, he does die the death that by his own testimony was expedient that he die. On the other hand, he dies having been not condemned as a seditionist, but in the most powerful way imaginable, the one man on God's green earth who had the authority and the capacity, who actually did the interrogation, and the one man who could indeed pronounce guilty or innocent again and again, against every impulse, every pressure. The man is innocent. Now let me tell you one other thing, and we're done. I think the good confession that Jesus made before Pontius Pilate is so desperately important, because it does indeed, there's nothing of arrogance or flippancy. Jesus is honestly, carefully, I think respectfully, deferentially answering the judge's question. That's exactly what he should do. We expect it. There's another reason why the good confession is so important, and that is the impact it had on Pilate. Jesus loved Pilate. And when Jesus is placed on that cross, we'll talk about it before, John 19, the titulus. It was fairly standard Roman practice that when a man died as a seditionist, there was a placard. Roman crucifixion of a seditionist was not about executing the seditionist. It was about putting down the sedition. And it was framed in many ways to make sure that it would arrest whatever seditious impulse was simmering in your heart. And so they would affix. And now Pilate comes and he affixes Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, in 3 languages. And of course, when the Jewish Sanhedrin, they saw that, they came running and said, "Don't write King of the Jews, write he said he was." In other words, he's a seditionist. And for one final time, Pilate says, "No, I'm not going to write that. He's not a seditionist." But Jesus had said just hours earlier, "You say rightly that I'm a king, and anyone who is of the truth hears my voice." Now Pilate proclaims his own testimony. This man is the King of the Jews. I think we're going to see Pilate in heaven. And I think it's because of the good confession that Jesus made before Pontius Pilate. That makes sense? All right. Thank you, Father, for the time together, and thank you for this marvelous, marvelous record. Thank you, Father, for the life that our Savior lived, and it was so blessed in every way. But even here in this marvelous drama before with Pontius Pilate, thank you for the record and for the opportunity to consider it. God, I pray that you go with us in the morning service. Thank you in Christ's name. Amen. All right, off we go.